It was just after sunrise when officers found the shallow grave. The ground was wet, the air cold, and a man's body lay half-covered by leaves. Next to him, 2 sets of footprints, one leading in, one leading out. The scene was quiet except for the low hum of radios and the steady breath of those who had been searching for 6 days. The call reached dispatch at 6:52 a.m. A volunteer had noticed disturbed soil near mile marker 12. Within minutes, crime scene tape marked a perimeter, and technicians began their work. Every layer of leaf and earth was photographed before removal. Beneath the final layer lay a young male, dressed in jeans and a blue sweatshirt. His hands were close to his chest. There were no signs of struggle. Identification came quickly. A wallet and phone were recovered. The license confirmed the name Daniel Mercer, 28, resident of Pine Hollow, Oregon, reported missing the previous week. The coroner on scene estimated the burial at less than 48 hours old. Decomposition was minimal, lividity light, and the soil beneath him retained cold moisture. A single blow to the back of the skull was immediately visible. At 7:45 a.m., a technician recorded a faint synthetic fiber near the victim's right hand. It was dark gray, plastic-based, inconsistent with any of the clothing recovered. The evidence was sealed and labeled for laboratory comparison. The surrounding ground showed overlapping footprints. The lighter print matched the victim's probable shoe size. The second print was larger, heavier, oriented toward the exit trail. The sequence suggested physical proximity at the time of death or concealment. Witness interviews established that Daniel had last been seen leaving a bar on Main Street with his closest friend, Alex Rourke. Both men had argued that evening, according to staff. Raised voices, then silence. Alex stated that Daniel walked home alone. The autopsy, completed later that day, confirmed death by blunt force trauma to the skull. No defensive injuries were found. Toxicology showed a moderate blood alcohol level. Time of death was estimated between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., 2 nights before discovery. One notable absence drew attention: the victim's silver wristwatch. Friends reported he wore it constantly. It bore an engraving of the initials AR and had been a gift from Rourke. Cell tower data later placed Alex Rourke's phone within 1 mile of the forest at 12:26 a.m., contradicting his statement that he had driven home. He told investigators he had gone out to clear his head. 4 days later, the community gathered for Daniel Mercer's funeral. Rain slid down the church windows as Rourke spoke before the crowd, describing the victim as a brother in everything but blood. Observers noted composure between visible emotion. His speech was precise, his pauses deliberate. The day after the service, a hiker delivered a photograph taken near the forest entrance 2 mornings before the recovery. In the background, through fog, a dark sedan appeared parked by the trail. The partial license plate began with 6K74, the same as Rourke's vehicle. Investigators cataloged the image as circumstantial, but retained it alongside the soil samples and the missing property report. Combined, the pattern began to form. Footprints overlapping in opposite directions, a missing watch, and a man whose grief seemed too orderly for chance. The evidence told a story still incomplete, but consistent in tone. A moment of violence followed by a controlled aftermath. What remained unclear was whether control began before or after the fatal blow. How long can sorrow hide intention before it starts to sound rehearsed? The homicide investigation expanded 3 days after the funeral. Search efforts shifted from recovery to reconstruction. The small-town rhythm of Pine Hollow gave way to forensic procedure: grids, diagrams, timelines. The objective was to identify the sequence of control, when Daniel Mercer's life ended, and when Alex Rourke began shaping its aftermath. Digital analysis produced the first contradiction. Daniel's final unread text messages had been sent from Rourke's number between 12:05 and 12:15 a.m., minutes before both devices lost connection. The content was brief and transactional. "You still owe me, man." Then, "We need to talk tonight." Daniel never replied. Cell tower mapping placed both phones within 3 miles of the western forest border, not far from the burial site. The data eliminated coincidence. Interviews with staff at the Iron Lantern Bar provided partial confirmation. Multiple witnesses recalled the argument. Raised voices, an exchange of money, Daniel leaving abruptly. Security footage was incomplete, missing 15 minutes near closing time. That gap concealed the transition from words to action. Evidence technicians issued the first lab report. The fiber recovered from the grave matched the interior carpet of Rourke's sedan with statistical precision. The pattern, pigment, and manufacturing residue were identical. Though not yet definitive proof of contact, it created an unbroken line from body to vehicle. Investigators traced Daniel's financial records. Debt accumulated across 4 credit lines, multiple small loans, and informal transfers from friends. The largest entry, $2,000, came from Rourke. It had been issued 3 months earlier under the label temporary support. Interviews confirmed Daniel had never repaid it. The emotional context was financial erosion. The forensic one was opportunity. A consent search of Rourke's car followed. He allowed access without hesitation, signing the waiver in clear handwriting. Inside the trunk were a blanket, flashlight, rope, and floor mats that appeared freshly washed. Swabs from the seams revealed soil consistent with that of Pine Hollow Forest. Same clay, same mineral ratio, same residual moisture. Under ultraviolet light, detergent traces fluoresced along the edges, indicating recent cleaning. Further microscopic analysis identified a flake of red-brown varnish embedded within the trunk's fabric lining. The fragment corresponded to the coating used on a wooden baseball bat, found broken in Rourke's garage weeks before. The bat's fracture angle mirrored the curvature of Mercer's skull injury. Despite the accumulating evidence, formal accusation required behavioral confirmation. During follow-up questioning, Rourke displayed calm precision. His statements remained identical across sessions, language nearly verbatim. He described driving to the forest to think, claiming Daniel must have gone there separately. When shown photographs of the overlapping footprints, he studied them briefly before stating, "Mine are size 10. His were 9. Shoe sizes had not been disclosed publicly." Outside the investigation, the community responded with sympathy. Local media portrayed Rourke as a loyal friend traumatized by loss. He appeared in candlelight vigils, speaking softly about Daniel's generosity and dreams. The same online accounts promoting his innocence were later traced to his own network address. Forensic confirmation arrived 6 days later. The fiber from the burial site and the fiber from Rourke's car matched at molecular level. Same polymer blend, same extrusion batch, produced in limited quantities for his specific vehicle model year. It was enough for probable cause. Investigators assembled the evidence chain. Digital correlation, soil comparison, fiber consistency, and behavioral alignment. The conclusion was not yet signed, but its outline was visible. In the weeks that followed, Rourke's behavior grew ritualized. He returned frequently to the forest, claiming a need for proximity to his friend. Witnesses saw him standing at the old search site for extended periods, silent, motionless. He gave interviews correcting small factual errors in the press, quoting official reports almost word for word. The repetition suggested rehearsal rather than grief. Meanwhile, a drone video from the initial search was re-examined. Frame 442, time-stamped 12:39 a.m., on the night Mercer vanished, captured headlights moving along the restricted service road. The pattern of illumination indicated a vehicle with a broken right taillight. Maintenance logs confirmed Rourke's car had that defect. A final element surfaced in the recovered soil samples, a metallic hinge pin consistent with a wristwatch clasp. The fragment carried partial engraving, 2 letters still legible. AR. The watch was Daniel Mercer's. The initials were not. By the 10th day of investigation, the question of involvement had narrowed to one point: motive. Debt and anger explained action. Control explained everything after. What began as a search for a missing man had become the study of a performance, one directed by the person who wanted to be found. A search warrant for Alex Rourke's residence was executed 1 week after the laboratory confirmed the fiber match. The team entered quietly at dawn. The interior was immaculate. Surfaces gleamed, shoes aligned by size, dishes stacked in geometric order. Disorder existed only where it had been designed to, on the corkboard above his desk, pinned with photographs of Daniel Mercer. Most showed ordinary scenes: 2 men fishing, hiking, celebrating birthdays. Others were prints from the search operation itself, clipped from newspapers. Each image was labeled with dates and small handwritten notes referencing light, posture, or emotion, as if cataloging a study rather than a friendship. Evidence collection began in the bedroom. Inside a duffel bag, officers found hiking boots still damp from use. Soil on the treads matched the chemical composition of the burial site. Beneath the boots lay a printed speech titled, "For Daniel." It was identical to the words Rourke had read at the funeral, formatted with notations: "Pause here. Look down. Inhale before name." Next to the paper was a receipt for industrial cleaning products dated 2 days after Daniel's disappearance. In the kitchen, a flash drive was located among bills and unopened mail. It contained digital photographs, some personal, others clinical, images of the forest at night, of tire marks illuminated by headlights, of the bar's parking lot empty under rain. Metadata showed the camera used was Rourke's own phone. One file was time-stamped 12:24 a.m. on the night of the killing, placing him precisely within the radius of the burial site. When questioned, Rourke dismissed the photos as coping exercises. He claimed he had revisited the area multiple times to understand what had happened, not to conceal it. His tone was measured, his answers deliberate. Only when shown the image of the forest trail did his hands tremble slightly. He requested a glass of water, then continued speaking as if nothing had changed. Further forensic analysis linked trace particles from the duffel bag to synthetic fibers in the vehicle trunk. The match completed a closed loop of evidence. Victim, scene, and suspect aligned through microscopic residue. The timeline reconstruction was finalized the following day. Based on call logs, surveillance, and witness accounts, investigators determined that the argument outside the Iron Lantern bar lasted approximately 12 minutes. Neighbors later recalled hearing a single thud followed by silence. At 12:17 a.m., Mercer's phone stopped transmitting. 9 minutes later, Rourke's vehicle was detected traveling west. Headlights recorded on a Forest Service camera at 12:26. By 12:41, GPS data placed the car stationary for nearly 20 minutes at mile marker 12, the location of the grave. The burial itself displayed characteristics of haste. The soil depth measured less than 1 foot, consistent with panic rather than planning. Yet the post-crime behavior contradicted that. Rourke's precision afterwards suggested intent to orchestrate perception, not to escape detection. He volunteered in search teams, contacted media, and repeatedly offered statements to law enforcement. Each effort placed him closer to the center of attention he claimed to avoid. Psychological analysis later described this behavior as compensatory performance, the transformation of guilt into visible grief. Each controlled gesture replaced confession with narrative authority. Witnesses noted subtle details after the funeral, how Rourke stood apart from the crowd, how he corrected misinformation with quiet certainty, how his tone when speaking about Daniel shifted from sorrow to explanation. Observers often mistook his control for strength. Investigators saw it as containment. When confronted with inconsistencies in his account, Rourke never hesitated. "Daniel needed help," he said. "He was my responsibility." The statement was recorded without further elaboration. As the investigation expanded, financial motives reappeared. Bank records showed Daniel had attempted a withdrawal from a shared savings account the day before the murder. The account was registered under Rourke's name. The withdrawal failed due to authorization restrictions. Hours later, text messages between them escalated into confrontation. The debt had become symbolic, not just monetary, proof of control lost and reclaimed. By the end of the second week, the evidence file had reached 100 pages. Each document confirmed a single premise. The act itself may have been impulsive, but everything after was deliberate. The case narrative now followed two timelines: the night of violence and the long performance of remorse. One ended with a buried body, the other with applause disguised as sympathy. The final entry in the weekly report summarized the state of findings. Suspect demonstrates sustained management of perception. Behavioral evidence indicates desire for proximity to investigation. Crime is not defined by concealment, but by authorship. In Pine Hollow, the forest returned to silence, but the story had already taken root. Behind every layer of grief, a pattern remained: clean, symmetrical, rehearsed. And somewhere in that symmetry, truth had become indistinguishable from performance. The transition from investigation to indictment occurred quietly. The evidence had reached a point of inevitability, yet there was no satisfaction in closure, only precision. Statements were cross-verified, digital data reconstructed, forensic samples cataloged in duplicate. The file on Daniel Mercer's death no longer resembled a mystery. It read like a design blueprint. Financial analysis clarified motive. Daniel's debts exceeded $20,000, divided among credit institutions, gambling accounts, and personal loans. The largest portion, $2,000, belonged to Alex Rourke. Transactions showed no repayment. 2 days after Mercer's death, Rourke initiated a transfer labeled loan reimbursement from his own account to Daniel's, manually backdated to the morning following the homicide. System logs revealed the falsification. When asked, he explained that he wanted the record to look right. Investigators reconstructed the final night minute by minute. At 11:48 p.m., both men appeared on security footage outside the Iron Lantern bar. At 11:59, they exited through the alley. Witnesses heard raised voices, one phrase distinct above the others: "You lied." At 12:06, nearby cameras captured Rourke's sedan idling at the curb, interior lights flickering as the passenger door opened briefly. By 12:17, Mercer's phone ceased transmission entirely. The forensic model of events placed the impact inside the car. The skull injury showed an angle consistent with a downward strike, likely from the passenger's side. Fibers from the seat's carpet were embedded in Mercer's sweatshirt, confirming close contact. The shallow burial later performed in the forest indicated no transport container, only direct transfer from vehicle to ground. The pattern of the footprints supported this. 2 tracks entered the clearing, one light, one heavy. Only one track left. Behavioral analysis outlined the aftermath. Instead of fleeing, Rourke reinserted himself into the investigation. He organized search teams, requested updates, and corrected official statements when reporters misquoted times or distances. His accuracy drew public trust. Grief and expertise fused into a single credible image. the man who had lost everything yet still helped others understand the loss. But within the case file, investigators noted anomalies in his language. In transcripts, he referred to Daniel in the past tense days before the body was found. In one statement, he said, "He was my best friend," then immediately corrected himself to, "He is." It was a small slip, but it exposed what the evidence already knew. The mourning had started before discovery. As physical findings accumulated, psychological insight replaced speculation. The burial was impulsive. The behavior after was architectural. The two halves of the act mirrored each other, one chaotic, one controlled. A week later, laboratory confirmation arrived on the blood traces recovered beneath the trunk lining of Rourke's vehicle. The concentration was low, diluted by cleaning solution, but DNA sequencing left no ambiguity. The match to Daniel Mercer was absolute. That result transformed probability into certainty. The warrant for arrest was issued before dawn. Officers approached the residence at 6 a.m. Curtains were open. Rourke was awake, seated in a chair by the window. When informed of the charge, he did not resist. "I wondered when it would be official," he said. During processing, his demeanor remained consistent, measured, unflinching, analytical. He confirmed fragments of truth but avoided confession. "He wouldn't stop pushing," he said. "It wasn't about the money anymore." He looked directly at the recorder. It was about silence. The official report summarized the statement as partial admission. No emotional outburst, no denial, only a description of noise and its cessation. In Pine Hollow, the arrest fractured the community. The same people who had carried candles at vigils now avoided eye contact at the market. Newspapers printed photographs of the two men side by side, one smiling, one in handcuffs. The caption read simply, "The friendship that buried itself." For the investigative team, closure was a technical milestone, not relief. Every sample, photograph, and transcript converged on the same truth. The murder of Daniel Mercer was both an act of violence and an act of narrative construction. The physical evidence explained how he died. The behavior afterward explained why. The final internal memo filed that evening summarized the case. The suspect exhibits post-criminal conduct consistent with compulsive narrative formation. Emotional response is structured, not spontaneous. Objective, control of interpretation. In the forest, new growth began to cover the clearing. The soil where the grave once lay had leveled with time, erasing the indentation. But even beneath the surface, trace elements of human presence remained detectable. Fibers, fragments, and memory in mineral form. Forensic truth endures long after performance decays. The arrest of Alex Rourke transformed a local tragedy into a formal case study. The town adjusted to its new vocabulary. Terms like motive, trajectory, and impact angle replaced words of mourning. In the records, every sentiment was measured by data: coordinates, timestamps, residue counts. Emotion was treated as evidence only when it could be quantified. Rourke's interrogation began the morning after his arrest. The recording showed him sitting upright, wrists on the table, posture symmetrical. He requested no lawyer, stating that there was nothing left to argue. When presented with photographs from the forest, his gaze lingered on the overlapping footprints. "They look closer together than I remember," he said. Maybe that's where he turned around. For investigators, the comment carried weight. It acknowledged proximity without concession. They pressed for sequence, how the argument escalated when the blow occurred. Rourke described an exchange that began with debt and ended with laughter. "He said I'd never see my money again," he explained. It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them. His tone remained level, but the phrase "the way he said them" repeated twice more during questioning. When asked about the burial, Rourke paused for 12 seconds before answering. "It was raining," he said. "I thought he might still be breathing. I didn't check." He described lifting Daniel from the passenger seat, the soil soft beneath the tires, the shovel already in the trunk from a previous camping trip. He claimed he dug only until exhaustion made him stop. "I didn't cover him all the way," he added. "I knew someone would find him." That statement redefined intent. What might have been considered panic now aligned with deliberation. The incomplete burial, the open trail, the later involvement in the search, all formed a coherent design. The illusion of remorse that required discovery to be complete. The session continued for 4 hours. Rourke answered every question except one. When asked why he kept the watch, he looked down at his hands and said, "Because it had my name on it." The interview ended at 15:42. The transcription was verified and sealed. The psychological assessment attached to the file classified Rourke as high-functioning, with dissociative features rooted in control fixation. He displayed no signs of psychosis, only a structured detachment. Public reaction followed its own forensic pattern. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse as the charges were read. Local media replayed segments of the confession, cutting between Rourke's calm expression and photographs of Daniel Mercer smiling beside him. The juxtaposition became the defining image of the case, the measured killer beside the man he buried. Inside the department, the focus shifted from confirmation to understanding. Analysts reviewed every behavioral detail from Rourke's post-crime actions. His insistence on joining search efforts, his corrections of media inaccuracies, his volunteering for interviews, all pointed to a singular psychological mechanism. He could not accept chaos. The killing had been spontaneous. Everything after had been a reconstruction of order. The final forensic summaries arrived 2 weeks later. Blood residue in the vehicle matched Mercer's DNA profile. Soil from the trunk matched the burial site to a 99% probability. Fiber evidence linked both environments conclusively. The chain of proof was unbroken. In sentencing memoranda drafted months later, prosecutors would note that Rourke's cooperation had paradoxically strengthened the case against him. Each confession refined by control made guilt more precise. The only variable left was motive, and even that seemed to serve structure rather than emotion. The official report concluded with a single line: "The subject's remorse appears intellectual, not moral." After the confession, Rourke was transported to county detention awaiting trial. Surveillance logs described his routine: reading, writing, periods of silence lasting hours. No outbursts, no sleep disturbance. Guards reported he often stood at the small window facing west toward the direction of the forest. In Pine Hollow, people adapted to absence. The bar where the argument began reopened under new management. The forest path near mile marker 12 was fenced off, officially for safety reasons. Visitors left flowers at the gate for months until weather reduced them to fragments of color pressed into the mud. The case had moved from life to documentation. Every voice, gesture, and silence had been converted into record. But the image that endured was neither the grave nor the confession. It was the pair of footprints in opposite directions, preserved in a photograph now filed in the evidence archive. They remained the only visible intersection of truth and design, one man leaving, another returning, and a moment between them where neither path could be undone. The trial of Alex Rourke began 6 months after his arrest. The courthouse was small, its benches filled with townspeople who had memorized every line of the story before hearing a word of testimony. In the courtroom, the air carried the quiet tension of unfinished mourning. The narrative that had gripped Pine Hollow for months was about to be formalized into evidence, stripped of emotion, and sealed with a verdict. The prosecution opened with structure rather than spectacle. They established time, location, and proximity. The argument at the Iron Lantern bar, the cell tower pings, the trunk fibers, the fragment of a watch engraved with the killer's initials. One by one, the physical pieces of the case were introduced, each a fragment of a larger design. The attorneys didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. The data spoke clearly, and the absence of emotion amplified its weight. Rourke listened to every word without visible reaction. He sat upright, shoulders square, eyes fixed on the evidence table. When the photograph of the overlapping footprints was projected onto the courtroom screen, he turned his head slightly, as if confirming the accuracy of a familiar detail. His defense built its argument on limitation, an impulsive act, not a calculated one. The lawyers described a moment of anger, a blow delivered in frustration, followed by panic. They portrayed the burial as desperation, the later composure as guilt's restraint. But cross-examination reduced those claims to fragments. The prosecution replayed recordings of his interviews, highlighting his precise recollection, his corrections of time and distance, and his absence of contradiction. Impulse leaves disarray. His story left none. Witnesses reinforced the pattern of control. Bar staff recalled how he paid the tab with exact change after the argument. Search volunteers remembered his instructions on how to organize grid teams. Even his funeral speech, transcribed and annotated, revealed choreography in cadence and breath. He had written his emotions before performing them. The state's forensic witnesses described the physical trail. Blood traces under the trunk mat. Soil matching the burial site. The polymer fiber found in the grave identical to that from the car interior. Nothing existed by chance. Every particle followed a logic of proximity. Victim, suspect, vehicle, forest, each touching the other in sequence. When his turn to testify came, Rourke declined. His lawyer spoke for him, citing his earlier statements as sufficient. The jury watched him sit still through the remainder of the proceedings, silent but not detached, as though monitoring the precision of a script he already knew. Outside the courthouse, the town's media called the case "The Anatomy of Remorse." The phrase caught on because it captured what people saw. Grief dissected under fluorescent lights until it became calculation. Each photograph, each quote, each timestamp confirmed that the story had always been self-contained. During closing arguments, the prosecution summarized what the evidence had established. This was not a crime committed in darkness, the attorney said. It was a crime followed by choreography. The defense argued for mercy, insisting that remorse should count for something. But remorse built to an audience, they said, was indistinguishable from performance. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. At 8:46 p.m., they returned unanimous. Guilty of second-degree murder. Rourke's reaction was minimal. A short breath through the nose, a brief nod. The judge sentenced him to 20 years. Before being escorted from the courtroom, he was asked if he wished to speak. He said only, "It's better this way, now it's finished." Yet nothing finished in Pine Hollow. After the verdict, the town returned to a quieter form of speculation. Some residents insisted he had confessed too easily, that no one so calm could truly regret. Others said calm was the only way someone could survive what he'd done. The distinction mattered less than the fact that people kept debating it. In the official post-trial summary, the reviewing board noted the case's unusual characteristics: a killer who inserted himself into his own investigation, and a confession so complete it erased the possibility of empathy. The document concluded with a single observation. The subject maintained authorship from act to adjudication. The court recorded his guilt, but the narrative remains his. When the case was archived, a single photograph was placed on top of the file. The one taken in the forest, showing two sets of footprints pressed into the damp soil. One entered, one exited. Both belonged to the same man. In Pine Hollow, the forest eventually closed around the clearing. No marker, no plaque, only the faint memory of symmetry in the earth. But for those who had seen it, that image became the story's true ending. A perfect pattern of violence and order, preserved in silence. Time altered the case, but never erased it. A year after sentencing, the Mercer file was used in lectures across law enforcement academies under the category post-criminal control behavior. Students studied it not for its violence, but for its structure. The killing had lasted seconds, the performance around it, months. It was a model of how guilt could be disguised as precision. Inside the state penitentiary, Alex Rourke adapted quickly. His conduct reports were unblemished. He read philosophy and criminal psychology, kept to himself, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Officers described him as quiet, polite, systematic. He organized his cell as if cataloging his life. Books alphabetized, sheets folded with identical corners. Each morning at exactly 6 a.m., he stood facing the small window on the western wall, looking toward the direction of Pine Hollow. Routine became his ritual. He wrote often, but not letters. Instead, he filled notebooks with diagrams and observations. He analyzed events like a technician reviewing a mechanism, reducing memory to sequence and cause. One page contained the line, "Every act must complete its symmetry, even in confinement." Another read, "They think remorse ends with a sentence. It only changes its direction." Psychological evaluation described him as introspective, but detached. He spoke of Daniel Mercer not as a victim, but as a variable that refused control. He avoided personal pronouns when describing the killing, preferring abstract language, the event, the noise, the correction. The most detailed notes came from a session recorded in his second year of incarceration. When asked whether he regretted the burial, Rourke answered, "Regret belongs to accidents. What I did was deliberate. The only mistake was underestimating how long the story would take to end." The transcript of that session circulated quietly among criminologists. Forensic psychologists cited it as evidence of narrative fixation syndrome, the compulsion to transform guilt into authorship. In Rourke's mind, the act had never been a loss of control. It had been a statement interrupted by discovery. Beyond the prison walls, Pine Hollow rebuilt its rhythms. The bar where the argument occurred changed ownership. The forest reopened to hikers. Yet at the Mile 12 trailhead, the soil remained uneven, its surface slightly denser than the ground around it. Locals avoided the spot without acknowledging why. Some swore they still saw faint impressions after rain, shapes that looked like two footprints, one pressed deeper than the other. In the third year of Rourke's sentence, an envelope arrived at the State Evidence Archive. It was addressed anonymously to the case custodian. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper bearing the words, "You don't dig a grave to hide something. You dig it to prove it existed." The handwriting matched Rourke's known samples, but no return address was listed. The note was filed without comment. Shortly after, a journalist from a behavioral science magazine petitioned for an interview. Rourke accepted. The conversation took place in a monitored visitation room. When asked why he agreed to speak after years of silence, he replied, "Because stories decay if you don't repeat them." The journalist pressed him on motive, seeking emotion beneath calculation. Rourke's expression didn't change. "Daniel was chaos," he said. "He gambled with everything, even trust. I wasn't angry. I was finished." The transcript of that interview ended with an exchange recorded at 10:18 a.m. "Do you feel guilt?" "Only for leaving the ending to someone else." When the article was published, it reignited public fascination. For Pine Hollow, the case resurfaced like a wound reopened by curiosity. Letters flooded the newspaper, some condemning, others empathizing. What disturbed readers most wasn't the act itself, but the calm articulation behind it. Within the correctional system, Rourke's conduct remained impeccable, yet officers reported subtle changes. He began refusing recreation hours, preferring to sit by the window. He requested no visitors, not even for holidays. One guard noted that he had started sketching the outline of 2 overlapping prints in pencil on scrap paper, shading one darker than the other. 3 months later, a routine inspection found him sitting upright on the cell floor, unresponsive. The scene was clean, the act methodical. Medical evaluation confirmed asphyxiation by self-administered means. No sign of struggle, no note. On the desk rested a single sheet of paper with 5 words written neatly across the center. The story ends this way. The incident report described the death as planned, not impulsive. Officials debated whether to classify it as suicide or final confession. His sentence had lasted 2 years, 9 months, and 16 days. For Pine Hollow, the news arrived quietly, traveling through whispers before headlines. The forest, the footprints, the speeches, all returned to conversation. For some, the ending felt like justice. For others, it sounded like another act in a performance that refused to fade. The file on Alex Rourke's death was added to the Mercer case archive. The summary attached to it read, "Subject maintained behavioral control to final moment. No observable emotional deviation. Psychological motive. Authorship of conclusion." The cycle that had begun in rain and soil now closed in silence. 2 lives reduced to 1 narrative. 1 act transformed into architecture. And beneath the surface of Pine Hollow, the ground held steady, quiet, symmetrical, unchanging. After the death of Alex Rourke, the Mercer case was formally closed and stored in the state archives under the designation Case File 44PH. The documents filled 3 boxes, each labeled with date ranges: disappearance, investigation, aftermath. The narrative was complete in form, but incompleteness lingered in perception. Pine Hollow returned to its ordinary routines, but the forest never recovered its neutrality. It had become an unwritten memorial. Academic interest in the case grew in the years that followed. Forensic institutes and criminology departments cited it as a rare example of intentional narrative manipulation, a homicide constructed not to conceal guilt, but to frame its discovery. Researchers described Rourke's conduct as performative atonement, in which the appearance of grief functioned as both defense and confession. Public fascination reignited with a documentary release 3 years later. It was titled The Last Footprints. The program combined police footage, interrogation excerpts, and dramatized reconstructions. The narrator's voice repeated Rourke's recorded words. "Every story needs structure. You don't improvise grief." Wachowi. The series ended with an image of the forest clearing, now overgrown, moss reclaiming the disturbed soil. Viewers responded with a mixture of revulsion and intrigue. To most, the case confirmed what they already believed, that some people don't seek forgiveness, only authorship. But to others, it raised an uneasier thought. If guilt can be performed convincingly, then sincerity becomes impossible to measure. Within the State Crime Lab, archived evidence underwent digital preservation. During the process, a technician discovered an encrypted folder in one of the transferred drives, previously inaccessible. The file was dated 3 nights before Rourke's suicide. When decrypted, it revealed a single recording. The image was static at first, then sharpened. Rourke sat at a narrow desk, wearing the gray uniform issued by the facility. His expression was neutral, his voice calm. "This record," he said, "is not a confession. Its clarification. He paused for several seconds before continuing. They say the story ended in the forest, but they're wrong. It ended when they believed what they saw. You think I wanted to hide Daniel? I didn't. I wanted to prove how easily you could all be led to closure. He leaned closer to the camera. The grave was never for him. It was for belief itself. The recording ended abruptly. The video was entered into the file, but not released publicly. Investigators who reviewed it noted no signs of delusion, no emotion, only composition. The purpose of the message remained unclear, either explanation or continuation. It was the final piece in a pattern that refused erasure. Years later, a visiting professor from a behavioral analysis program requested access to the complete Mercer file. In his published study, he concluded that Rourke's final act, ending his life in the same calculated manner he structured every phase of the crime, demonstrated the ultimate extension of control. His body became the last piece of evidence, the report stated. The investigator was denied the final word. He wrote his own closure. In Pine Hollow, memory diluted but never disappeared. Tourists still asked locals for directions to the old trail, though most were advised against entering the forest after dark. The land appeared ordinary, trees rising over wet ground, the smell of pine and moss. But those who lingered long enough described an unusual quiet, the kind of silence that feels deliberate. For the few who still remembered the case intimately, that silence was the only true relic. There were no plaques, no markers, only the weight of repetition. Every year, when the anniversary approached, new articles appeared online, retelling the story with slight variations. Each version borrowed phrases from the previous one, like echoes aligning into a single unbroken tone. The state's final memorandum on the Mercer investigation summarized the total conclusion. Physical evidence confirms the sequence of homicide and concealment. Behavioral evidence confirms intentional manipulation of perception. Subject demonstrated narrative fixation through continued authorship post-incident. Motivational basis, structural control of legacy. It closed with a final sentence written by the reviewing officer. Endings are not the absence of sound, but the point where silence becomes deliberate. The Mercer case never truly faded. It was absorbed. In Pine Hollow, the forest grew dense again, yet the ground at mile marker 12 remained slightly uneven, as though the earth still remembered the weight of something that once insisted on being found. 10 years after the Mercer homicide, the case no longer belonged to law enforcement. It had become material for study. In universities, it was listed under behavioral constructs of control, used to illustrate how guilt could evolve into authorship. Students knew the pattern before they learned the names. The crime had taken seconds. Its echo had lasted a decade. The archived files filled 3 boxes. Box 1 contained the field photographs, the shallow grave, the footprints, the recovered phone. Box 2 held transcripts and autopsy notes. Box 3, labeled post-conviction materials, carried everything that came after: interviews, correspondence, and the final psychological evaluations before Alex Rourke's death. Together they formed a closed system, a story within itself. Yet every time the case was re-examined, analysts described the same sensation: that they were following the script of someone else's design. The last official review began with routine digitization. Technicians converting analog evidence to digital format discovered a small encrypted drive misfiled between duplicates. The metadata traced it to Rourke's personal laptop, seized at the time of arrest. Decryption revealed 40 text files, each labeled only by a number. At first, the content appeared to repeat known statements, descriptions of the bar, the argument, the burial, but the phrasing shifted slightly between versions. In some, the language was in first person. In others, detached and observational, as though the author were both subject and analyst. File 40 ended with a line that unsettled the team reviewing it. The story continues as long as someone tells it. The discovery reignited interest in the psychological framework of the case. Forensic specialists called it an echo loop, a compulsion to preserve control through repetition. Rourke's writing showed no remorse, only maintenance. Each iteration refined structure rather than memory. His crime had been physical. His legacy was editorial. The new findings were forwarded to the Behavioral Analysis Division for secondary interpretation. Their conclusion was precise. The perpetrator exhibited perceptual recursion, a tendency to rebuild his narrative through those who studied it. Every retelling, they warned, risked becoming a continuation. Outside academia, Pine Hollow had grown used to silence. The bar was gone, replaced by a pharmacy. The forest had thickened over the closed trail, now posted with warning signs. But stories have their own climate. Tourists still asked locals to show them where the body was found. Some were sent in the wrong direction on purpose, to preserve the illusion that the place could no longer be found at all. Reports occasionally surfaced of unusual sounds near the Mile 12 clearing, metal scraping, voices under wind. Rangers dismissed them as echoes from logging equipment miles away. Yet visitors continued to describe the same impression, the sense of being watched by something patient, not alive but aware. The state archivist overseeing the digitization wrote a personal note in the system log. Every time we open the Mercer files, the order reasserts itself. Nothing new, yet it always feels recently written. The observation was later redacted, but not deleted. In 2033, a behavioral researcher from the University of Oregon published a paper titled Symmetry as Confession. Using the Mercer case as a framework, the study proposed that Rourke's burial method mirrored his personality, half chaos, half correction. The shallow grave represented impulsivity. The meticulous search participation represented restoration. The paper's final sentence summarized the duality with clinical precision. The killer sought truth, but only the kind he could arrange. For Pine Hollow, the case returned as quiet folklore. Residents referred to the forest as the place that tells itself. Teenagers dared each other to reach the old service road and take a photograph of the locked gate. No one ever went farther. The soil near the clearing, even after a decade of erosion, remained slightly denser than its surroundings. Aerial scans confirmed a subsurface depression precisely matching the dimensions recorded in 2023. The ground had healed but not forgotten. The documentary released that year reignited public curiosity. It opened with archival footage of rain sliding across the crime scene tape, then cut to a narrator reading Rourke's words. "You don't dig a grave to hide something, you dig it to prove it existed." The episode ended with a slow pan over the forest floor, the camera settling on the faint trace of overlapping footprints. Viewers mistook them for recreations. They weren't. Following the broadcast, the archive received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a printed photograph identical to the missing evidence photo from the original file. The footprints captured before the rain. The envelope bore no sender and no fingerprints. The postmark originated from a town 20 miles west of Pine Hollow. The file containing the discovery was marked for restricted access and sealed again. Officials issued no statement. The public was told the image was a promotional artifact from the documentary. But among investigators, speculation persisted. The timing of the envelope, 10 years after closure, and its exact duplication of a lost photograph, suggested deliberate orchestration. Whether it had been sent by a researcher, a collector, or someone mimicking Rourke's logic remained unresolved. The final state review appended a short advisory to the case index. Do not reproduce images from file 44PH, without contextual limitation, narrative contamination risk. By then, the case had evolved from tragedy to cautionary study. It demonstrated how evidence could survive in two forms, the physical and the interpretive, and how the latter could never be fully contained. The same story that once unfolded in soil and silence now persisted in citation and theory, repeating itself through those who analyzed it. Every file in the Mercer archive ends with the same photograph. Two prints in wet earth, nearly aligned but not identical. One deeper, one lighter. The official description reads only, "Footwear impressions, victim and secondary source." But the visual symmetry remains too precise to dismiss as coincidence. The story of Pine Hollow no longer resides in memory or belief. It exists in documentation. Yet even in record form, it continues to evolve. As the last archivist noted during the final audit, "We keep saying the case is over, but the evidence never stops arranging itself." The forest, in its quiet patience, seemed to agree. By the 15th year after the Mercer homicide, the case no longer belonged to the justice system. It existed in libraries, on servers, and in whispered retellings across classrooms. Each version changed slightly, but the framework stayed fixed. A young man dead, a friend confessing, a forest holding its silence. The more the story was analyzed, the more it began to sound like ritual rather than report. When the State Archive transferred its collection to digital-only format, the Mercer materials were among the last to be processed. The team responsible for verification described unusual consistency in the file structure. No corruption, no missing data. Everything had survived as though preserved intentionally. The technician assigned to audit the drive wrote a short line in the internal log, "Case remains intact beyond reason." At the same time, a behavioral researcher named Evan Brooks, working under a grant on post-criminal authorship, began reviewing the case for a book. He requested access to Rourke's personal writings and the final video recovered from the penitentiary. His request was approved under supervision. Weeks later, he contacted the archive director with an observation. "The final recording doesn't look like a suicide message. It looks like instruction." The footage had been examined countless times, yet Brooks noticed something others had ignored. A reflection in the cell window behind Rourke. Faint but deliberate, it showed a single page taped to the wall. The visible line read, "End where it began." Brooks believed it referred not to the forest, but to the documentation itself, to the story's tendency to regenerate whenever studied. In his manuscript notes, he wrote, "The narrative sustains itself through inquiry. Each observer becomes an unwilling participant." His paper, later published under the title Echo Crimes, argued that Rourke's true legacy was not violence, but contagion, a design so carefully built that it forced replication. The more people sought to understand it, the more they rehearsed his structure: introduction, discovery, confession, resolution. In this model, the reader completed the act. The theory was controversial, but persuasive. Within a year, it had influenced new terminology in forensic psychology: performative recursion, describing a killer who controls interpretation even after death. Case 44PH became its textbook example. Pine Hollow's forest, meanwhile, endured another cycle of reclamation. Rain washed away the last remnants of the old service road. Moss covered the gate. The soil where Daniel Mercer was found sank fractionally lower each winter, forming a shallow depression almost indistinguishable from natural erosion. Only satellite imaging revealed the subtle geometry: an oval precisely 3 meters long, faintly darker than its surroundings. Every few years, hikers rediscovered the place, unaware of what lay beneath. They described a sudden stillness there, a quiet so complete it seemed intentional. None stayed long. The forest, it seemed, had learned to curate silence as carefully as Rourke once curated grief. When the state announced plans to decommission physical evidence older than 15 years, a final inspection of the Mercer archive was conducted. During that process, a sealed envelope was found inside Box 3, misfiled between inventory forms. The envelope contained a single printed page. It was an excerpt from an earlier report, annotated in unfamiliar handwriting. Truth isn't in the evidence. It's in who tells it last. No signature, no timestamp. The note was logged as an artifact of unknown origin. After the review, the digital archive went live. Thousands of users accessed the Mercer materials during the first week, citing them in research papers and podcasts. The pattern repeated itself: interest, interpretation, silence. Each version of the story adjusted its focus, some on motive, others on morality. But all returned to the same symmetry of footprints. The state's final entry in the official record summarized everything. Case 44PH concluded. Subject deceased. Evidence complete. Behavioral sequence demonstrates full control of narrative post-event. Psychological assessment. Authorship as compulsion. That was the last administrative action before the file was permanently sealed. Years later, long after Pine Hollow had outlived its reputation, one final photograph surfaced anonymously online. It showed the forest under fog, ground damp and uneven. In the foreground, barely visible, were two overlapping impressions, one fading, one newly formed. The metadata listed no date, but the GPS coordinates pointed to mile marker 12. Analysts debated authenticity, but found no signs of manipulation. The image joined the rest, another repetition of the same pattern. Arrival, departure, symmetry. The Mercer case had begun with a body half buried in the earth and ended as an archive that refused to die. It demonstrated that evidence can decay, but intention can persist, quietly, invisibly, replicating itself through curiosity. No one spoke Daniel Mercer's or Alex Rourke's names anymore. Only the place remained. A stretch of forest that had learned to keep its own record, unspoken but perfectly ordered. And beneath the moss, where rainwater still gathered in the shallow depression, the ground waited, dense, symmetrical, and unwilling to forget. Next case dismantles another perfect crime. Don't miss it.